org.
Good morning and welcome to The Skinny for Friday, July 10th. I'm Mitch Perry, the senior political reporter for the Florida Phoenix, joined by my colleague for the first time in 3 weeks, Ray Rowe, the editor-in-chief of Creative Loafing newspaper. Ray, how's your summer going?
Mitch, it's been awesome. It's good to be back. I was up in the Pacific Northwest, a part of the country you're very familiar with, Alaska, Seattle, traveling over there. So it's cool to see places with transportation, cool developments.
A little less incredibly hot and humid.
And I'm happy to be here with you this morning because I know you got to see Tame Impala last night, as I did. And I know that that's your favorite band.
Yes,
so.
In fact, we should tell our listener, that opening song that we have here for The Skinny, since we've been on the last 3.5 years, that's a song called It's Not Meant to Be from the Inner Speaker, their first record. So Tame Impala, yes, let's talk for a minute about Tame Impala.
I love this. I love when I can get Mitch off of the news thing for a little bit.
Right. We'll get to our guest in just a minute, and we've got a really good show for you. But yeah, so in fact, I'm looking at the Tampa Bay Times. Okay, Gabriella Calise just wrote a review of the show. She writes, three wandering psychedelic journeys disguised as songs into Tame Impala's sold-out concert at Benchmark International Arena with a sonic boom of the bass shaking my molars and a curtain of rainbow lasers threatening to trigger a small seizure. Anyway, she goes on. That's just like the way
I will definitely co-sign on that, and I will add that it was amazing to show up to a concert and see a bunch of synthesizers and Moogs all kind of set up in a circle. In a world where everything is kind of driven by AI and technology, it was very cool to listen to music like that made by humans in front of you. It felt like a very human show last night. I know that's the essence of live music, but more than other concerts, I think last night felt very much like people making music. I felt like I was in the club at times last night. I wanted to go to Hyde Park Cafe immediately afterwards.
Well, there's that mixture of like their earlier stuff, most of their stuff, which is guitar oriented, and then this last record that came out last year, which is very dance oriented. And that's some of the long hardcore fans are not so enamored of the new sound. But hey, it was all spectacular last night.
Believe it or not, this is not a music show.
Yeah,
people.
No. Let's get down to it. But anyway, it's good to see you, Ray, because again, we've been away from each other for a couple
weeks
here.
It's great to be here.
So, okay, on the show, a little later on the program, we're going to, big primary election, August 18th. And I say the biggest local election here in town is the St. Petersburg mayor's race. And, of course, we've been featuring some of the candidates on the show over the last few weeks.
The ones brave enough to show up.
Which is, most of them. And today we're going to have Jim Large. Of course, he's the former fire chief. He is in studio right now, and we look forward to talking to Jim about what his plan is if he's elected to be the next St. Petersburg mayor. But first, in the first part of the show, we're going to feature the issue of childhood poverty in Florida and what some organizations are doing to combat it. We talked about this a little bit about a year ago, actually, when President Trump signed the big, beautiful act, if you will, because that included some changes to SNAP, basically the federal food stamp program. So we will get into that and some really, troubling statistics here. There are 11 million out of 74 million children in the United States who live in poverty right now. In Florida, there's approximately 711,576, and they just reside in 15% of Florida's 152 zip codes, according to the Florida Prosperity Initiative. So joining us to talk about this right now via Zoom is Sky Beard. She's the Florida director with No Kid Hungry, and Mark Wilson, the CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce. Good morning, Sky. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Morning. Ditto.
Okay, great to have you here with us. And the topic this came up, and Sky, I know somebody your folks came and reached out to us when last month, and we didn't get a chance to get this on the program last month. But the Florida Prosperity and Economic Opportunity Solutions Summit was held last month here in Tampa, which looks at the issue of childhood poverty in Florida. And Mark Wilson, let me begin with you. Tell me more about the Florida Prosperity Initiative. How long has this been in existence?
Yeah, hey, thanks for having us. And Sky, thank you for your partnership with No Kid Hungry as well. Look, here's the deal. We've been doing this for about a decade in Florida. We're a national leader. Other states are looking at Florida, wondering if they can replicate what we're doing here in Florida. But very big picture, when we think of it, if Florida was a country, our economy would be the 14th largest economy on the planet. Right? So our economy is bigger than Mexico's, for example, bigger than Saudi Arabia. We create about 1 out of every 12 new jobs in the United States right here in Florida. However, we have over 700,000 kids in poverty. And so what the Florida Chamber Foundation and our members started doing about a decade ago is really trying to look at the data and peel back how in the world can we have this economy that's creating so many jobs and so much wealth, but how do we still have kids in poverty? And so the Prosperity Initiative is about a collective impact model of how can we share ideas, how can we use data to find out where are these kids, where are these families, and what are the root causes that is keeping them generation after generation from breaking that cycle of poverty. And so we've been doing it about a decade. The last 2 years has been a really big focus. Our board is growing. Sky is a big leader with us at the Florida Prosperity Initiative. And so hopefully we'll have a chance to get into some of the data and some of the causes and, more importantly, some of the solutions. But if we can cut childhood poverty in half by 2030, then we'll be on a pathway to completely eliminating childhood poverty years after that. And that helps Florida become the 10th largest economy in the world down the road. But we can't do it unless our economy works for everybody. And that's what this is about.
Right. And I know we've got the root causes, and we'll go into that in a minute. But I believe I saw on your website or the website for the Florida Prosperity Initiative that you have, since you said this has been going on for about a decade or so, that childhood poverty in Florida has declined by nearly 200,000 kids. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it sure is. And what's impressive is we have a lot more kids today than we did 10 years ago, but we've gone from over 23% of kids in poverty, to down. Now we're into the, 15, 16, 17%, depending on what county you're in. So clearly the model's working, and but it needs to work for more people, and we need to attack it at the zip code level and at the root cause level. And that's what we're so excited about.
Well, let's talk about the root causes. You've listed 10 root causes here, and we'll go over them right now quickly here. And many of these will be familiar with folks, and that is food insecurity, unattainable housing, lack of available quality education, poor transportation, unaffordable childcare, lack of financial literacy, unsafe homes and neighborhoods, lack of economic opportunities, and lack of agency and community voice. I got to believe it. Obviously, some of these are easier to attack than others. I mean, obviously, the issue of housing, right, is something we know has affected everybody basically in the state. But we do have it in certain pockets, specifically, say food insecurity. Mark, if you want to talk about some of those root causes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity. And let me start with a number of years ago, I was invited to testify in Congress on this topic because Florida, again, pioneers this idea of how can we cut childhood poverty in half, and how do we do this? Let me just start with this. Childhood poverty is too big for the White House and Congress. It's really too big for a governor and the state legislature. In fact, in many ways, it's too big for a county commission. What we found in our research that we've done over time in working with the Federal Reserve and working with the National United Way and with many of our partners like Sky is to really combat this, you have to understand it at the neighborhood level, right? If you think about it, Miami is a very different place than Palatka. And, Tampa is a very different place than, say, an hour or two outside of Tampa. So we have rural, we have urban, we have all kinds of different mixes. And so we look at the zip codes. And as you said at the top of the program, we have 711,000 children in poverty in 983 zip codes, but more than half the kids in poverty live in only 15% of our zip codes. And so just in Hillsborough County, just to give you a local example, there's about 49,000 kids in poverty. You have 51 zip codes in Hillsborough County, but half the kids in poverty are in only 10 of those zip codes. And you asked about root causes. Once we know where the kids are in poverty, we then can go into a zip code using the FloridaGapMap.org as a tool, and we can realize that each zip code is actually different. It just like every person's different and every fingerprint's different, every zip code's different. And so in some zip codes, food might be a prevalent problem and housing and crime. In another zip code, it might be food and jobs and transportation. Food is pretty ubiquitous. It's a challenge pretty much everywhere we go, which is why we're so grateful that Sky and her organization have solutions. But I think we need to look at it as 983 zip codes, each with their own unique makeup and challenges, and we need to use data and collective impact to know exactly what the solution is for the exact zip code. And that's what the model does.
Again, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Skinny here on WMNF. Mitch Perry with Ray Rowe. We're speaking about child poverty here in the state of Florida. We're speaking with Mark Wilson, the CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce, and Sky Beard, the Florida director with No Kid Hungry. Sky, let's get you into this. Tell our listeners more about what No Kid Hungry is all about.
Yeah, we're quite aligned with what Mark's been talking about. We are tackling food insecurity and child hunger in a number of different ways. We are a funder for a lot of great work happening across the state that you might know of in your local communities, from schools to local nonprofits to food banks. We're a hub of resources and best practices. We really are fond of looking across the country and seeing what other people are doing and borrowing those great ideas and bringing them to Florida. We do a lot of policy work. We do a lot of communications work, elevating this issue, which is why my affiliation with the Prosperity Project is so important. It's another way to bring these important issues to people that need to hear it.
Well, on policy, let's talk about that for a minute, if we could, because obviously some of these things can't, government obviously can only do so much, but government can do things, obviously. I'm thinking, for example, about, about childcare, right? And this is like a national issue where we hear candidates talking about that. And there were some proposals. I was looking, as we're preparing for the show, about things that maybe could have looked at this a little bit. I don't think any of these things got anywhere. There was a bill, by HB 765, Fiona McFarland and Fabian Basabi, that included revisions to child care facility licensing requirements, proposed establishing a Florida endowment for early learning to support child care funding and setting up a Center for Early Childhood Professional Recognition. That bill passed all of its committees but died on the floor. There was another bill by Kristen Arrington, Central Florida Democrat, that would have required the Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability, or OPAGA, to study public and private employee child care assistance programs and deliver findings by later this year. That could have influenced future employer-based care supports in the state. Mark, is there anything, let's talk about, policy prescriptions that could, have either been introduced or you'd like to see happen on the state level that can maybe try to hit some of these root causes?
Yeah, I'm really glad you talked about early learning and childcare, because if we fix early learning in Florida, we fix 1,000 other things, right? We have choices to make. We can either, the Department of Corrections is the largest agency in state government in Florida, and we can either continue to invest downstream or we can start investing more in the early years. And in Hillsborough County, only 35% of our kindergartners are ready for kindergarten on day one, and only 53% of Hillsborough's third graders are reading at or above grade level. We need 100% of kindergartners ready for kindergarten and 100% of our third graders reading at grade level. When we talk about childcare, I'm a pilot and I always talk in terms of headwind and tailwind. Childcare is a major headwind in Florida. It is most families are spending more on childcare than on their house, and it costs more to put a kid in infant care than it does to a university today, and that makes it cost prohibitive for a lot of families. The Florida Chamber Foundation did a report recently called Untapped Potential, where we chronicled that over 150,000 adults with children under 6 quit work. 150,000 adults quit work in less than a year because they couldn't find quality childcare or they couldn't afford it, and their only option as a family was to be at home, and that might mean pulling kids out of regular school and doing homeschool. So there's all kinds of downstream effects. So what we need from a policy standpoint, in fairness to the legislature, they've done a lot in the last several years to create tax benefits and incentives for companies. In Southwest Florida, Arthrex, which is one of the world's best manufacturers, is investing tens of millions of dollars in childcare and early learning. They're probably the nation's #1 example of how to do childcare the right way. Now, we need all-day pre-K. We need more awareness about the importance of pre-K. I don't want to go off the deep end here, but early learning is so important. 2/3 of kids who go to a quality pre-K are reading at grade level. Only 1/3 of kids who don't go to a pre-K are learning at grade level. So when we look at pre-K and we look at childcare, it's really all part of a bigger investment Florida needs to make in our early years. It helps the families, it helps the community, it helps the employer.
Do we have, and I apologize for not remembering, do we have a universal pre-K or no in the state? Did we have that initiative on that years ago?
We do, and it's voluntary and it's partial day. And so, one move we could make is to try to make it available for more people and for a longer period of time with certified teachers and with a big commitment to quality outcomes, no matter where you are, rural Florida or urban Florida. We're a national leader on this, by the way, but we have a lot of room to grow.
Again, we're speaking about child poverty here in the state of Florida here on The Skinny with Mark Wilson, CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce, and Sky Beard, the Florida Director with No Kid Hungry. Sky, I want to talk to you about SNAP. As we mentioned a little earlier, this is really starting to take effect now, these cuts to SNAP benefits. This goes back to the President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act from last year, which contained significant changes to SNAP, changes that affect eligibility rules, work requirements, payment accuracy, and allowable purchases, and those changes were expected to cut billions, over $100 billion in federal spending over the next decade. Since then, every state has seen a decline in people enrolled in SNAP because Congress requires states with SNAP payment error rates of more than 6% to contribute towards the cost of the food beginning the next year. And states with error rates of 10% or more would have to contribute 15% towards the food costs for the program. And I was looking at a story of my colleague, Christine Sexton, with the Florida Phoenix, which is that newly released data from the Department of Agriculture shows that Florida has lowered its error rate to 13%, but that's not enough to avoid a nearly $1 billion cost share contribution next year. Can you talk more about how that's hitting at the local level?
Yeah, a whole lot of numbers you just included there, right? The biggest being the $1 billion figure. So you are correct. And I think I'll just say that SNAP is also a really good example of what Mark was just talking about in the early childhood space, where it's a combination of federal policy and state policy and local business and families really being able to access programs that they're eligible for. And SNAP is a really critical tool that we have in the toolbox to fight food insecurity. It's not the only one, but it surely is a critically important one. And one that I know Kid Hungry we're paying a lot of attention to, because we do have about 3 million Floridians, over half of them are households with children that participate in SNAP. And you are correct. There were some really historic changes made at the federal level going back to July 2025 that really changed how SNAP is structured, not only in terms of some eligibility criteria that families have to meet, but also in how it works in terms of funding. And for the first time ever, states are having to contribute out of their state funding to the benefit cost itself for the money that families use in order to put food on their table. And that's never happened before. So states are really in a difficult position of having to figure out what that all means, where it's going to come from, a lot of timelines that have to be considered to kick in. And you are absolutely correct that the error rates that came out just a couple short weeks ago, the end of June, for Florida showed that we have what's called an error rate of 12.97%. And now I'll just mention that's a decline of where we were. Right. The year before, we were at 15.13. So we're heading in the right direction, but not yet enough that we're going to avoid having to figure out how we're going to contribute $1 billion to feed folks in our state.
Sky, this is for you, maybe for Mark, because he's in touch with so many businesses daily. To piggyback on what Mitch was talking about SNAP, nobody can deny that SNAP helps families, but we live in this world where, SNAP is demonized. People will point to that 10% national error rate or Florida's error rate, which is declining, and they'll say, well, that's exactly why it shouldn't happen. And then they see people at churches or communities feeding each other, and they say, that's how we solve hunger and things like that. Sky, how do you talk to people who are just convinced that government shouldn't be in the business of helping people who are hungry? And then maybe for Mark also, how do you talk to these business owners and some of these high-level people who and convince them that a program like SNAP is worthwhile?
Yeah, great question. And no doubt that local food banks, food pantries, churches, folks who are, doing everything they can to feed their neighbors and local communities are doing a fantastic job. But they will often be the first ones to tell you that they can't be the only place that people go when they are in need of food, and they are not a substitute for programs like SNAP. SNAP helps kids from homes who are really working and doing everything they can to put food on the table. It supports our seniors, our veterans. There are lots of folks who are using SNAP really as just a bridge during a difficult time. And a lot of times those local food resources will tell you they are at max capacity. And to be able to absorb the need if SNAP were to be reduced significantly in the state is something that they likely wouldn't be able to do, even though they surely have the heart to do it. So it's one of those great examples where there is a role for government, there is a role for local communities, there is a role for business, and we need all of them working efficiently in order to support kids in the state.
What about you, Mark? You talked about poverty, but when you are with your Chamber of Commerce hat on and talking to business owners who maybe might not be convinced that SNAP does help, how do you talk to them about government programs and how they work in together with some of these community programs that Sky was talking about?
Yeah, I so love this question because I've been on my own personal journey with this, right? When I testified in Congress a decade ago, the first several outreaches I had were from people complaining that I was going to Washington talking about the business community's interest in cutting childhood poverty in half. And the assumption was that people who are in poverty, that it's their fault, that they don't want to work, that they just want to take government handouts. And maybe there are some people who fit in that category, but let me tell you what we found in our research and what we've observed. If you're born into poverty, if you're born into a zip code with bad schools, where you have 30-40% unemployment. If you're born into that situation, these root causes make it almost impossible for you without help from somebody, without a network, without collective impact. They make it almost impossible for you to learn and then earn your way out of poverty. And so our country, Republicans and Democrats did this. We created a situation where the less you make, the more government will give you. And what happens is it's a disincentive to make another $1 an hour, to make another $5 an hour. And so we have advocated that our country have a bridge to help you get more education, to help you get more learning experience, and keep those benefits until you can afford to wean your way off of them. We literally have government policy across the country that is advantaging someone to make $9 an hour instead of $25 an hour. And when people hear that, they think Mark must have misspoke. But no, our government policy in the United States is you're better off making less money. And so much of the reforms that Congress is trying to do, that Florida is doing, is to give an advantage to people who want to improve their situation. So again, the business community has been on a 10-year education curve with this, and most business leaders simply didn't know that we had this much childhood poverty in the zip code that they live in. If you travel with me to West Palm Beach or to Naples, where we have extreme wealth, people literally would tell me, we don't have any childhood poverty in my zip code. And then I direct them to the FloridaGapMap.org or to FLProsperity.com. And I encourage them to look at the data in their zip code, in their county. And 100% of the time, people are wowed by it. They say, I didn't know it. I don't know that I believe it. But if this is true, then what can my company do to help with this? And that's what the whole Prosperity Initiative is about. When we think of food, right, I mentioned early learning earlier. If you're going to school and you haven't eaten in a day, you think you're focused on what the teacher's trying to teach you. So things like food become essential to everything else, but it also, the data becomes vital, which is why we're going around Florida educating business and community leaders in all 983 zip codes to get familiar with what's happening in your neighborhood, because that's where we're going to attack this and that's where we're going to transform it. It's why other states are coming to Florida to look at the model.
I do want to say, and we mentioned this about universal pre-K a moment ago, a listener just wrote in, Christina, and I just want to quote from her email here. She says, as a single parent, I find it incredibly difficult to afford the cost of childcare in Florida. Preschools are very expensive. They generally average a minimum of $1,000 per month. That's on the low side. And she says it's insulting that the state of Florida consistently markets that VPK is free. It is not free. The state provides only 3 free hours of VPK per day, and most parents work 8 hours full time. She said the city of New York has always provided full-time free VPK. Wages are higher in New York and substantially lower in Florida. How are average working class and even middle class parents supposed to afford this? And I think that's really a very relevant thing to bring up here. Sky, going back to you for a moment and going back into SNAP, if we could. I know that you worked with a polling firm recently, right? To talk to people about the fact that these benefits or what was going to be happening here regarding SNAP funding. Can you tell me some of the highlights in that survey?
Yeah, we just wrapped up another year of the last couple of years. We've done a really extensive statewide poll, really just to check in with folks and see, how's it going when it comes to feeding your families right now? How are things working for you in terms of all the competing fiscal priorities you have in getting food on your table? And the results were not surprising for those of us that do this work and are kind of in touch with these issues every day, but they were really alarming. We heard, again, year over year, the last few years, the vast majority, over 80% of folks are saying that the cost of groceries is rising faster than their incomes. And that puts people in a really difficult space where they're having to make challenging trade-offs on a regular basis. Am I going to run to the grocery store and be able to feed my kids tonight? Or am I going to put gas in the car so I can get to work tomorrow? Those are some of the real life things that Mark was talking about that we see in our survey as well. People want to provide for their kids. People want to work. People are working. People are wanting to engage in all that they can to be self-sufficient. But it is incredibly challenging for people right now. And that's the kind of data through the survey that we also bring to communities as we're talking so people understand. One of the other things that really came up this year in our poll is the increasing number of folks who are incurring debt just to feed their families. And what emerged this year that we hadn't seen before was over a quarter of those respondents said they were resorting to buy now, pay later types of arrangements at the checkout of their local grocer just to be able to put food on the table. And I'm not talking incurring debt that people are making choices about which credit card might give them, the best rewards or points. I'm referring to using debt as a way to feed their families, because if they don't, the children in the home will not eat that evening. So it's a different kind of incurring debt than others might be familiar with. And this resorting to buy now, pay later types of programs is something that's obviously concerning. That's not fiscally healthy for a lot of folks, but really does speak to what people are challenged with on a regular basis across the state.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Mark Wilson, if I could ask you one question before we go on a political front, on that is, has the chamber come out one way or the other on Amendment 3, the property tax amendment that we're going to be voting on in November?
We're analyzing that very, very closely. I think it'll be a win in some counties and a big loss in others. And remember, I authored and shared the 60% initiative way back then, which was also Amendment 3, just as a fun fact. I think it's going to be pretty hard to get to 60% once all the voices come out on that. And I suspect the 2027 Constitute Tax and Budget Reform Commission will be looking closely at putting something else on the ballot in 2028 for voters to consider. So we literally are just coming out of the market. We've asked businesses in all 67 counties to dig deeply into this. We actually did a side-by-side so that everybody could actually understand this, because I think it's pretty widely known what the governor came out with and wanted isn't exactly what the legislature's final product was. So there's a lot of confusion in the market about what everyone thought it was going to be versus what it is. So we're doing a whole lot of education across the state right now on what is it compared to what people thought. And I think there's a lot of confusion brewing on it. There is a lot of unanimity in certain parts of Florida that when the cost of local government rose a lot faster than the growth of that area, there are a lot of people who want to know what can be done about that. And I think that we'll probably be looking at this for a couple of years if this one doesn't pass this fall.
All right. Really interesting to hear your thoughts there. Okay. Mark Wilson, President and CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce, and Sky Beard with No Kid Hungry, an organization working to end child hunger. We thank you both for talking about this really important topic. Thanks so much for joining us on The Skinny.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to move on now. Jim Large. Good morning, Jim.
Hey, good morning, Mitch.
All right. So, folks, we're
Chief
going
Large.
We're going to transition now from talking about that topic to getting local here. Again, we've got a major election, of course, August 18th. Everybody listening to us here, if you're living in Florida, you'll be, hopefully voting. By the way, let's put this out there. The deadline to register, July 20th, which is a little over a week now. So if you're like me, who's an NPA,
Or change parties, yeah.
Yeah, this is the terrible thing about not having open primaries. I'm sorry, I will take a stance on that. I do think that it's limiting us when you can only vote, but that's the way it works. But not in a municipal election, Jim Large. So yes, it is a. But anyway, so let's tell people Jim Large is here. He is the former chief of the St. Petersburg Fire Department, and he spent over 50 years, right, public service before stepping down in 2024.
18 years as chief. 18 years as chief, correct?
18 years as chief, correct.
And Jim, the first thing I could do, and we didn't mention it here at the beginning, but yesterday we learned that the passing of Jack Latvala, right, the legendary, I would dare say, state senator and consultant and power broker in northern Pinellas County politics for decades. Were you working with him at all in this campaign?
Well, my consultant is his son, Chris Latvala.
Oh, okay.
And,
Yeah.
But Jack was meeting every once in a while and giving us some advice and stuff. And I've known Jack for many, many years. And like you said, just he knows. I'm not a politician, so Jack's advice on politics was very valuable. And I have to tell you, I'm still in a state of shock because I just talked to Jack last week.
Is that right? Yeah.
And, he went up to Maine, and I just, like I said, just hard to believe.
Yeah, I talked to Daryl Roussan, who said he saw him 2 weeks ago in Orlando. And, so it's very sad and sad. Our condolences to the Latvala family. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about your candidacy. When did you decide to think about challenging Mayor Ken Welch and running for mayor?
When did I decide?
Yeah, how long ago was this process?
So, it's not about challenging Ken Welch. So quite some time back when I was early in my career, I guess you could say, since I did 50 years, but around the 25-year mark, I started having a little bit of an interest in perhaps running for city council someday and maybe mayor someday. But then as time went on, and, I never dreamed I'd be fire chief for 18 years, that 4 different mayors. That just typically doesn't happen in the political world. So I said, well, that passed, But then as I was nearing retirement, I had people start reaching out. What's your plan? What are you going to do next? And people asked me to consider to run. And then I retired, and I was, I don't know. But then Helene and Milton came, and there was a lot of people that were unhappy, and my phone even went off more and more. And I just sat down and I talked to a lot of people, and I actually tried to convince some other people to run, and maybe a little younger. But when you're younger, you got responsibilities, you got kids, you got things you got to be at, you got work, and so I decided I have the time, and I've always liked the challenge, and I'm a career public servant, and I miss public service.
Right.
I don't feel like I'm contributing to our city unless I'm can meet a challenge.
You're 70 years old, or 71?
What's that?
Are you 70 or 71, Jim?
Well, I'm a very young 71.
Yeah, I was going to say, you look great. I mean, 70-year-olds, they do it, but you look incredible. I want to ask you, there's some people, depending on who you talk to, they think that Charlie Crist camp is really trying to end this in the first round here and get 50% plus one. I know you say you're not a politician, but sometimes in my head, I'm like, man, fire chief, sometimes that's a pretty political position. What do you say to all this politicking around the race and people really thinking it is Welch or Charlie Crist? You're in this race with Brandy Gabbard, Kevin Batdorf, and Maria Scruggs. Right. What do you say to stuff like that?
Well, again, I think the people have to make a choice on what they want at City Hall. So, years ago, we were city manager form of government. So, person managed the city. And then there was the referendum, and we changed to a strong mayor form of government. And what I saw in my career was we interjected political agendas to City Hall as soon as you went to a strong mayor form of government. I think we need to get back to what's more like a city manager. I think the strong mayor at the local level should manage the city core services and not get carried away with like a special interest or political agendas, or even in some cases personal agendas. So for me, it's just I've watched the city grow and neglect infrastructure. Number one, that's one of the biggest things, that I'm looking at, is that our streets are terrible. Our sewer system is very, very old, and it's been band-aided here, band-aided there. It's time for somebody to buckle down and say we're gonna fix infrastructure. It's not the cool thing. Nobody wants to see the streets torn up, but they also don't want to see the sewage backing up into their homes.
No.
For me, like I said, I'm not a politician, but yes, you're right. People ask me, how did you survive 4 different mayors? I think it's because the fire service, you have a particular job, if you will, and it's the same. And that's how I feel like the leader of the city should be. You provide the infrastructure, you provide public safety, parks, libraries, all the basic core services. And I think I'm the only one that has the experience. 50 years of public service. No one else can say that. 18 years of executive leadership within the city of St. Petersburg. Nobody else can say that. So I say put politics aside. It's a nonpartisan race for a reason, and let's put somebody in that's going to lead and going to make the tough decisions.
All right, let's talk about a lot of things we got to talk to you about. One of them is Mayor Welch last week announced his selection to redevelop the historic gas plant district.
Yeah.
He selected this group led by the Blake Investment Partners to redevelop approximately 58 acres of the district, and the Pinellas County Housing Authority to develop the affordable housing on the 3rd Avenue parcel. Calls for 3,600 affordable and workforce housing units, more public infrastructure, Central Park featuring museums and landmarks, a workforce training center, and a small business success story. What are your thoughts?
So, I've said from the start that, this is an extremely valuable tract of land. When you put infrastructure in there, it's going to double the value of each parcel. And I think you got to be careful that you don't undersell it or undervalue in that sale, because this could have a tremendous impact on the infrastructure efforts for the city. But let me back up a little bit. Everybody thinks the door's closed on the Rays. I'm one that doesn't think it's closed, and I'll tell you why. So they're going to have to play somewhere. They're not going to have a stadium built by 2028.
Or 2029 at this point.
2029, the lease expired. Yeah. So, and they don't have the first dollar committed. They have MOUs. They have nice renderings. I say, why are we trying to push this forward when we still don't even know the status of what we're going to be doing with the Rays? And I know they say, well, we can start the development over here and leave I just think that you have to slow down on this. I get that there's been plans but all those plans were when the Rays were staying. This latest part popped up because everything fell through.
Right.
So I just think, again, you have to slow down, and we have to make sure the city gets the best value from that land.
Right.
It like I said, it's $1 billion piece of property.
Again, we're speaking with Jim Large. He's the former fire chief of the city of St. Petersburg, and he's one of the 6 people on the ballot, on the August 18th ballot for the mayor of St. Petersburg. You mentioned a moment ago infrastructure. And we're seeing, I guess, the city address some of that. And this is really costly. Certainly not sexy, but as we've learned after Helene and Milton, it's so necessary. Mm-hmm. Would you do more like the city does? Like, we are paying now more as residents for some of this stuff, and we may be paying more in the future, but it's worth it, right? Is that what you're saying, basically?
Well, yes, there's 2 parts to that, though. So right now they're talking about a $600 million, cost on the ballot.
You're right.
I don't think there's been a hard dive into the money that's there now and how it could be redirected to infrastructure before we settle on $600 million. We've seen a 40% increase in revenue to the city since 2022. That's a significant amount of money. And in that time, there was almost a $93 million increase in salary and benefits. So, and we know we had Blaise Agolia come in and do FAFO or whatever, and then the mayor called it political theater. I think it probably falls somewhere in the middle. I think there was, politics involved, as we say. But I do, having worked there is money to be saved. Yeah. And before we start taking on a debt that has a multi-million-dollar payment every year, let's look at where we can find some money to fund infrastructure projects now, and then determine how much we need to get. But yes, it's extremely costly. But why? Why is it costly? Because it's been neglected for far too long.
You just mentioned FAFO. You mentioned Blaze and Go. We talked to Mark Wilson there about the property. It's going to be Amendment 3 on the ballot. Where are you now? Again, this is going to. We know the city is already. It's going to be hard, St. Petersburg, if this passes. Now, some would say, like I guess you're saying, you've seen some fat there in the budget, and some of it can go. So let me just ask you: Are you going to vote yes or no on that?
Like Mark said, there's been some changes and stuff, and I'm not 100% familiar with what those changes were. Clearly, the governor's not supporting what his original.
Right, he's going to still vote for it, he said, but he's not going to go campaign for it, even though he pushed it for the last year.
I'd like to see a little bit more, and very candidly, I haven't dug into it. One thing I've learned about campaign, it's the hours are long and the pay's not that good. But anyway.
And here you are.
Yeah, I haven't dug into it enough to make that decision. Would I like relief? My taxes are high? Absolutely. So on that end, I would lean towards voting for it. I still think that the impact is not going to be as great as some of the fear that's been placed out there. There's things like, and I'll say it, there's an in-town CRA that takes millions of dollars from the ad valorem every year. It was created in the 80s for the blight downtown. Well, you live in St. Petersburg. Do you see a lot of blight downtown?
No, I see a lot of expensive things going up in downtown St. Pete.
There's $104 million in that CRA. And
that's still going on, obviously, as you're saying, and that maybe should not be going on any longer.
Yeah, no, they just pulled again this year, 20-something million for the in-town and the Southside CRA. When you look at that, how much of that could be, even if it stayed in the in-town area, how much of that could be directed to sewer and streets? There's 30-something million of it that's obligated for peer debt, but the remaining balance of that is sitting there and should be utilized, but because of the way it's written, it can't be. But is it time to sunset that? I think it is. So that's just one example of the many things that we can do before we press the panic button on the $35 million. And then they say $75 million in the second year. Let's make sure we explain that clearly to the people. That $35 million is part of that 75 in the second year. It's not a new $75 million on top of that. So there's a gradual growth in that reduction. But at the same time, we're going to have more luxury condos built that are already on the that are going to contribute to the tax base because they're not going to be homesteaded. And we're not doing away with property tax. It's a reduction. So there's a lot of factors here before people really sit down and say, oh my gosh, the sky is falling in St. Pete.
So, Jim, we need to ask you about, of course, what happened in August of 23 when you were placed on leave amid allegations of racism, sexism, and homophobia. Now, this happened after anonymous complaints were made in a survey of city employees, also about a lack of diversity and not enough promotions opportunities for people of color. So let's see. Now, again, Ken Welch, of course, Mayor Welch, who you're running against now, he looked at this. He said there was a careful review of the allegations and said, quote, no one had firsthand knowledge of evidence of racial, homophobic, or sexist comments from the chief. Even those few who supported a change in leadership had no direct knowledge or evidence of such statements by Chief Large. Talk to us about that.
Well, you answered part of it there. Yeah. He found none because there was none. So that's the first thing. I didn't take an adversarial role at all in this. It was an anonymous survey, and it was really orchestrated by about 7 people out of 400 and something. So the first thing I'll tell you is I stand on my 49 and a half years leading up to that with one complaint, 49 and a half years. The second part of that is we provided the data to Mayor Welch in the investigation. In the 18 years, actually, it was about 17 years at the time. My hiring was 49% minority and protected class. Hired more black firefighters than any chief in the history of the department. The promotional success rate for black firefighters in St. Pete was 90%. That's the highest of any race in the organization. Now, with that said, in 18 years, only 15 black candidates took a promotional test. Of the 15, the city has a policy called the Rule of Fives. You have to be in the Rule of Five to get promoted. So that's not my policy. Only 10 of them made it to the Rule of Five, and 9 of them got promoted. So that's a 90% success rate.
There was also, Jim Large, a 2014 committee that Mayor Kreisman at the time, his transition team, which recommended your removal based on the failures from promote minorities.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Well, all I know there is Mayor Kreisman had a committee, transition team, never heard a word, and all of a sudden that came out in the report. And it was, according to, at the time, it was 2 individuals on the committee that interjected that into the report after the committee had met. Some of the committee members went to Mayor Kreisman and said, we never discussed that. So obviously Mayor didn't do anything about it, and he retained me because he knew that it was a little bit of a orchestrated effort there.
Again, if you're just tuning in right now, it's 11:51. You're listening to Skinny here on WMNF 88.5 FM. Mitch Perry with Ray Roa. Speaking with Jim Large, he is one of the 6 candidates on the ballot, the August 18th ballot in St. Petersburg for mayor of St. Pete. Jim, you were at, let's see, let me bring this up first, but January 1st, coming up next year, there's going to be a new state law going into effect banning local governments from promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programs. I think you've been asked this. Well, let's ask you this. The question was asked at you at one of the mayoral candidate forums. How can you reassure voters that you will represent all communities across the city? So we'll just ask that question again to answer for you.
Well, again, I go back to my my record as fire chief, hiring more minorities and protected class than anybody in the history. 49%. I hired about, if I remember, it was around 385 people in 18 years, and 49% being, like I say, minority or female. I think it's kind of a simple answer. And in my time with the city's always been very aggressive in trying to be diverse and supportive of that. I think you just continue that. I didn't think that we needed a department to tell us to do the right thing. You just do the right thing. Now, you have to balance that, especially in public safety, the firefighting. People have to be able to do the job. You don't just hire to hire. So there's a very equal opportunity there to pass the requirements to be a firefighter. I think whatever job it is, they all have that baseline that needs to be done. But then you have to look at how are you going to represent the community to the best. So it's a balance. But again, the city's always done a great job, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The fire department, the city.
But could we ask about the police? So let's talk about public safety. So, how do you feel about the police? Are you a fan of Chief Holloway? Would you make a change if you were in office?
No, Tony and I work together quite a bit, and yes, I do. I guess you'd say I'm a fan of.
Okay, good. And do you think we have enough officers right now?
I honestly don't know. I have not talked to Tony about his staffing since I've been gone. I know they were always aggressively trying to hire. They came up with some bonus programs. So I know it was a challenge. They extended the drop to try to retain employees longer. So I really don't know what their situation is on staffing right now, but that would obviously be a priority, is to make sure that they continue to try to have full staffing, because, public safety is number one.
Right.
Chief Large, let me ask you this. We talk about, you mentioned just do the right thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't have to think about it. But we also are in unprecedented times. This is a nonpartisan race, but we have a Republican governor who went out of his way to make sure we erased rainbow crosswalks. St. Petersburg is largely known as one of the most inclusive cities when it comes to LGBTQ plus communities. I just got off the phone with the folks at Girls Rock Camp, and they've created this space for gender non-conforming folks and girls to really express themselves and build confidence. But it seems like at the state level, those communities are being attacked in a way. I don't know if attacked is the word you want to use, but those communities might use those. How would you continue to keep St. Petersburg a place where queer people feel safe?
I think, again, it goes back to what I feel the local government should do is everybody, I use 911 as an example in the fire service. When you call 911, they don't ask you what your sexual orientation is. They don't ask you what your race is. They don't ask you any of those things. They ask you, what do you need? And that's what local government should do. We don't ask you any of that. You need clean water. You need your toilets to flush. You need to be safe when you're out on the streets. You need to be able to go to nice parks. And the list goes on and on and on. So my feeling on that is the city should provide equal service across the board, fairly, equally to everyone, and not get into the battles, if you will, that are on the political side, especially at the state and federal level. Again, I go back to local level is about services. We elect people to go to Tallahassee and D.C. to deal with political issues.
So kind of a political issue, but also an issue with our pocketbooks in St. Petersburg is the energy prices that we pay for our air conditioning and the like. And as you well know, Jim Large, there is a Dump Duke campaign out there to get rid of Duke Energy Florida and have the city take over its own municipal utility, which would be a major change, transition, no doubt about it. City of Clearwater is also looking at this, as we know. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I stand right now, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't change my opinion in the future, but I would be against that right now. And it's very simple, and I've experienced myself. The city can't get the water utility billing right.
And what's up with that? Is a horrible thing going on in the city, and it has been. Luckily, I have not had any issue there. But so many, as you well know, people probably complain to you.
Yeah.
Some of these bills are looking nice.
And there's not been a real clear answer. And I understand that there's money been earmarked for a consultant. I thought they'd already hired the consultant, but recently I heard they had not, to try to find out what the problem is. I have one of the new meters, the highfalutin ones. Anyway, I still had some high water bills. My water bill's higher than my electric bill. So if we can't run a water utility, we don't have no business trying to run the electric utility, in my opinion. So I just think right now the timing is not good. When you talk about everything that's going on, we need to get that right.
So, Jim, you were with a public servant for 50 years. So you've been in the city such a long time. And the city is, we all know, anybody who lives in St. Petersburg, who's lived there for any amount of time, or just visited and you live in the Bay Area, has seen this city evolve. It's a very popular place to live, although we've actually seen some population erosion because the cost of living, I think, is one of the storms. So, do you think everything has been for the positive, though, or in terms of, like, we talked about downtown a moment ago and how the condos and all everything going up there, it's a different place, definitely.
Yes.
What's your thoughts about how the city has changed over the years and decades?
Well, I think that we go back to infrastructure. That's the first thing. We focus so much on development. Downtown was dead. I was here. I was a district chief driving around downtown after Moss Brothers closed and trying to pre-plan which vacant building was going to come in at midnight and how we were going to, what was our strategy. And then we've had that, as Rick Baker used to say, we had a 25-year overnight success. I think you have to have a balance. So I think we're at a point now where development needs to be very strategic. We can't just continue to throw up. And two quick examples. The Hilton purchase, going to be tore down. It's going to be luxury condos, we're told. The Times office building that got damaged by the crane, going to be tore down, replaced with condos. That's not strategic. We're losing job opportunity space. We're losing jobs at the Hilton. We're losing meeting space. We're losing tourism location. That's not strategic. So for me, the development needs to focus now on a strategic approach, and they need to pay their fair share for the infrastructure.
We just have a few seconds left, but I think we have a caller who wants to talk about water bills, actually. Hello, Bob. You're on WMNF.
Yes. Just so you know, when you have a problem with your water bill and you call the water department, they get up here and they say that, you have a leak. And tell them you don't have a leak. They don't care. In fact, at my house, I have two meters, one for potable water and one for irrigation, but it's with potable water. But on my water bill, I have 3 meters for it.
Right.
And I asked them what that's for, and they said, well, one's for the water, one's for the reclaim, or for the potable water for irrigation, and the third one is for waste disposal. But you don't measure waste.
Right.
And the meters run in gallons, but they change it to cubic feet, so the numbers always round up for them.
Hey, Bob. Thank you, Bob. We got to actually run.
10 seconds. You want to respond to that?
Thank you, Bob.
We're going to look into that, and we're going to get it right.
Right on. That's the voice of former St. Petersburg Fire Chief Jim Large. He's also a candidate for St. Petersburg Mayor. That election coming up very quick here next month. Your registration deadline is coming up in less than 10 days. On the top half of the show, we do want to thank Sky. Help me with the last.
Sky Beard?
Sky Beard from No Kid Hungry. Mark Wilson from the Florida Chamber of Commerce talking about child Poverty. I'm Ray Roa on behalf of myself and my co-host Mitch Perry and our board operator Anthony Medor, Skip Sassy, the board operator, actually Anthony Medor on the phones. This has been WMNF Tampa. Thank you so much for supporting community radio. I see Joellen Schilke in Studio One. Dave Decker still in here. He's talking to you, Joellen, about an art show over at the Crest Contemporary happening this weekend. We'll see you guys next Friday.
Yeah, we will. We'll have Senate candidate Angie Nixon, one of our guests.
Awesome. Thank you so much.